Heavenly Gifts. Jesus speaks about the history of the Gospels. April 24th and 25th, 1864. Translated and spoken by Pascal. The Gospels. April 24th, 1864. Well, my dear servant, that partially deaf bear in your dream has led you into a great evangelical contradiction, which you have not recognized since childhood, in spite of reading through the New Testament multiple times. I myself would have made you aware of it in the times to follow, but it is better for you and many others that this matter has come to light now already, so that all may discern and realize that I have come again in the Spirit now, and that I am quite perceptible on this earth, to hire and incorporate the final laborers into my vineyard. And these laborers are the worldly wise and the worldly wise philosophers, who try with great zeal and seriousness during this period of time to completely eradicate and devour me in the manner in which I now exist in those so-called Christian sects, and those gospels which have become what they are today, through pagan and Jewish machinations, only 200 to 300 years after my presence on earth. The blind humanity still believes, for the most part, in such an unholy concoction in my name, because it never has, nor ever will check and discern anything. I do not want to judge Luke, Mark, or Matthew because of that, for they have at least made an effort in their time to search for the purest and best of my teaching, which has been blemished many times already. But where the material facts are concerned, they have partly conjectured for themselves, but for the most part they had to take something in the end, what they heard from the mouths of such people who were sassy and cocky enough to pretend that they were eye and ear witnesses. Thereafter, they compared it with the known parts of the old prophets, and found it to correspond with what they have written. And therewith was their criteria for the truth of that, what they themselves had written down, completed and valid. If the Gospels would have remained that way, it would certainly still be much better than it is now. For in those Gospels, way too little was written for mankind of the marvelous, of the horrible, and of the awful things, so that they found it necessary later on to add certain things, especially the Jewish Christians, the Greeks, and the Romans. This happened already 100 years before the big church assembly in Nicaea, especially those admixtures which smell vigorously like miracles, and those that have quite a judicial face to transform me as the benefactor of the people into the exact opposite. The one who has told them to hold nothing as dear to their hearts as the love and the truth. I have never railed against the right science of humanity. Rather, I have taught the people about many things on various occasions, about which they have stood in ignorance and blindness. That is why the deceit-addicted Pharisees hated me the most, because I taught the people everything, wherein the Pharisees tried their best in the past to dumb down the people for their idle causes at every possible chance they got. And they have taken it so far that a high priest like Annas and Caiaphas proclaimed with a fierce voice in the temple that nothing but blood shall flow in the river of Kidron for 3 days, and that the sun shall not shine for an entire day, to push the people to a greater willingness to sacrifice. Believing such nonsense, the people retreated into their innermost chambers, out of fear from such a punishment. When the time of the punishment was over, they visited the river of Kidron, full of fear, to see if blood was still flowing. And when the Kidron had its natural water, the people had nothing more bustling to do than to bring massive sacrifices to the temple and lay them at the feet of the priests. Of course, the sun was shining continually on such a day, and in the Kidron River no drop of blood was flowing, whereof the clever Jews had convinced themselves, and they also wanted to instruct the poor and the too superstitious common Jews about it, but mostly without success. For they have seen, in their fear and delusion, that the blood was flowing, and that the sun was not shining for an entire day. and how the common people were in the most blind superstition at all times, so they are still today. You can tell such people the most absurd and marvelous fairy tale, and they will believe it. And when they circulate it to their neighbors, then those will add a lot of things to it and pervert it into something even more wonderful, if it was not yet wonderful enough, what was told to them by the first relater. But they are not interested in any kind of truth at all. Because of this, it was also most difficult in my time to bring the rather conservative Jews to recognize the truth. A miracle had to happen for them to awaken from their slumber, and then to start thinking a little for themselves what I had said and meant with this or that. But I have told the apostles already in my time on many occasions that they should teach and preach less about my miracles and more about the inner depths of the truth of my teaching while spreading it. Only one of them, John, stayed true to that admonition. All the others heeded it much less. They preferred to immediately start with the miracles, and after that they started to talk about the kingdom of God and the inner truth, once those listening were already entangled beforehand by the miracles. The addiction of talking about miracles continued to increase so much from one decade to the other that a great number of the partially written and even more of the traditional gospels increased in such a way that nobody could make head or tail of it all. Luke, as well as the pseudo-evangelist Matthew or Rabbas, have started to record their gospels not so many years after me, but already then they were mistaken in many things in such a way that, in the end, even among themselves, the greatest contradictions had to come to light in so many very important aspects. There was no discernment back then, for every evangelist had his certain listeners and readers, and he didn't care much about any other evangelist. And the evangelists themselves sticked also only to that which they themselves had written down. And they even were delighted sometimes if another evangelist did not have something in his gospel or this or that one possessed in theirs. And so, even Rabbas didn't concern himself much, or not at all, with Jesus, who got circumcised in the temple 8 days after his birth, and also not with the 3 wise men, and with the escape to Egypt, and with the massacre of innocents in Bethlehem by Herod. Rabbas, pseudo-Matthew, has received this information in Tyrus and Sidon, and has subsequently recorded it. But because he himself was more heathen than Jew, he didn't care much about the circumcision of the child Jesus. And so, these 2 evangelists display one of the strangest contradictions among themselves. All the while, they harmonize in many other things, including time and place details. And so, according to Luke, a Jesus exists who was circumcised in complete accordance with the Jewish laws and the customs, who was born in a barn in Bethlehem, and who was only greeted by the shepherds, and who was not visited by the 3 wise men, and who didn't need to flee to Egypt, but rather comfortably returned to Nazareth, where he quietly awaited his 12th year without any persecution from Herod, and then undertaking a walking tour with his parents to Jerusalem. In Matthew's version, we see Jesus being born into a proper house, who was not greeted by the shepherds, but by the 3 wise men, of which Luke didn't dream in his gospel. Neither about the escape to Egypt, nothing about the gruesome slaughter of children in Bethlehem by Herod, and again nothing at all about the return of Jesus from Egypt to Galilee under King Archelaus. On the other hand, Matthew didn't dream about the circumcision of the 8-day-old Jesus in the temple, as well as a bunch of other things that took place. And so, according to these 2 evangelists, you now have a circumcised Jewish Christ, as well as an uncircumcised heathen Christ. With Jesus' 12th year, the 2 evangelists started to become unanimous again, except for a few minor details. Now, everybody shall ask themselves, who of the 2 evangelists has kept the truth? The answer is, actually, neither one, for they both reported only that of which they had heard themselves. Nobody dared to talk about it in Jerusalem, because of fear of the excessive gruesomeness of Herod. However, in Sidon and Tyrus, in Celesyria, everybody hated Herod more than death, and no one was silent about Herod's savagery and whatever caused and led to it. In the same way, while reading and comparing those two Gospels, you would find many quite important contradictions and irregularities, which could be more easily corrected to a certain degree than the circumcised Jewish Jesus and the uncircumcised heathen Jesus. But therefore, now in this time, both the old and even more the new nonsense, which stands in contradiction to me, must be completely eradicated from these Gospels, and I myself with it, so that the soul and the true Gospel of John may step into its full light. For everybody will easily understand and realize that I, under the aspect of these four now existing Gospels, as well as some of Paul's letters and of the other apostles, cannot exist anymore for the length of time, because every contained contradiction therein is making me look like a contradiction in the eyes of the worldly wise, similar to the current existing Christian sects, of which every single one has their own Christ, who takes the freedom to himself to condemn every other Christ of the other sects, crisscross. Whoever does not want to believe this, just look at the Catholic conversion formulas. When a Protestant wants to convert to the Catholic Church, read them, and you will be fully convinced of the mutual condemnation of one another's Christ. For, in that, the converting one has to condemn his still Protestant parents, his birth with everything and everyone, including his Protestant faith items, into the deepest depths of hell. Only then will he be accepted by the community of Rome's believers and incorporated with all kinds of ceremonies. And that's the status between most of the major sects. How can there ever be one shepherd and one flock, when the Christs of the sects themselves are far more furious with each other than the wildest animals in the forests? So, all of this has to disappear, and for that cause I have already instructed the laborers in my vineyard, and they work hard and diligently, and many others will soon follow after them, who will work even harder and more effective, so that I may come to the people in the truth, as the true Jesus and God of eternity, and not as one like now, who has nothing else to do than to condemn and judge, according to the principles of each sect, and can only please and bless the ones in heaven who have been found worthy by their so-called representatives of God and leaders of the sects. For example, when one stands in the favor of such a representative of God, especially through some extraordinary offerings, this same one then has to stand in my grace as well, according to their doctrine. You surely have realized by now that such utter nonsense cannot exist anymore, after I have risen as a flash in the firmament, in spite of all the concordats. That is why we now leave the full latitude to the science, for it is a useful sweeping tool to eliminate all the dross of the world. At the same time, it is a giant Hercules who understood how to cleanse the great barn of Auge from its dung, an old tale from the ancient heathen times that can still be useful today. Consider well what I have now shown and given to you, and let it enlighten you, for it is given to you by me, the one and only true Christ, and not by a pseudo-Christ, to whom the truth is an outrageous abomination. Amen. The development of the New Testament. Historical overview. April 25th, 1864. I have made you aware of quite a few other small contradictions already yesterday, which are contained in the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and Mark. And I want to make you aware of many more that have become entrenched so much in the different congregations, not only among these three known evangelists, but even more so among many other so-called evangelists and circulators of my teaching, be they heathens or Jews, that only after about 30 years after my presence on earth, because of all the various statements in the scriptures, literal wars and other brawls have been started. which, like those in Nero's time in Rome, have erupted amongst Jewish Christians and Paul's heathen Christians in such a hostile manner that it seemed necessary to Nero to exterminate a great and considerable number of the Jewish Christian population in Rome, including a large part of the city in which they lived. He didn't even spare the Romans, who publicly paraded the motto of the Jewish Christians as an identification label. But this gruesome persecution of the Jewish Christians by Nero didn't bear much fruit either, for under the rule of Nero's successor, the Jews again knew how to infiltrate Rome, and they transformed Rome into a second Jerusalem, like the Greeks did in Constantinople. And once this had happened, especially the Roman Jerusalem, Rome, became more and more powerful and fabricated that what has affected the Roman pontificate. And they did so partly from the Jewish Gospels, but also partially with the acceptance of the old temple practices of Jerusalem and with the ones of the Roman heathen. The Romans possessed, according to that, all sorts of Jewish Gospels, as well as the old Jewish scriptures, and also the heathen Gospels. And so, they deployed certain learned church fathers, who were the leading fabricators of the Roman dogmas, which were often in complete opposition to the Greek Gospels, especially because the Roman spiritual leader had nothing better to do than to send his missionaries to the Greeks, which, after 325 years after my time, caused such confusion amongst the believers that many Greeks started to build heathen altars and temples again, in which they offered sacrifices to the gods and goddesses Minerva, Apollo, Jupiter, and Ceres. Emperor Constantine, who was a zealous Christian, determined to keep this mischief in bounds by arranging a great church assembly in the city of Nicaea as the headquarters of the various religious beliefs, to which the leading bishop of Rome was invited too. Constantine himself acted as the chairman of this event and showed them all the severe consequences which must arise concerning Christ from this huge disparity of beliefs in recent times. Constantine suggested a complete inspection of all of the many written Gospels and even more of the traditional ones, and he said that out of these many completely contradicting Gospels, only one should be used, namely the one of John, so that the Christians would reach unity amongst each other and not persecute each other like wild animals because of all the disparity of faith. And the heathens rather would return to their old paganism than to remain in such a teaching, of which nobody can find out anything that is true and righteous, even with the best knowledge and intentions. For if there existed one founder in the Christian teaching, it had to be only one, who also delivered only one teaching to the people, and this teaching must also have one significance and one spirit. But there are a great number of written Gospels existing already for a long time now, and an even larger number that are passed down from mouth to mouth, and each of them talks about their own Christ, who has nothing in common with all the other Christs. Thus, all of these Gospels will have to be completely discarded except for one, which might probably be the oldest one. And if that will not be approved by the bishops, then he would completely distance himself from Christianity and again raise the old heathendom in his great empire, which, in spite of the many gods, was much more united than this riven Christianity. The Greek bishops remarked that the names Matthew, Mark, and Luke also reach back into the old Christian times and not appear double or multiple times under one and the same evangelist's name. And the emperor agreed under one condition, namely that the teaching of the heathen apostle Paul should also be taken into consideration, and to clean out all the other Gospels with it. The emperor was told that not even Paul always remained consistent in his teaching, and that he wrote completely different letters to the heathens, and again completely different ones to the Jews, which were not completely congruent in meaning and spirit. And Constantine said that this would matter, for Paul had proven quite clearly, by words and deeds, that he didn't preach a false Christ, but only the one whose spirit gave him the wonderful ministry of a true apostle of Damascus. After more than 30 years of assessment, finally everything was discarded, except for the 4 still present Gospels, including the book of Acts by Luke, and Paul's letters, and a few other letters of Christ's old apostles. Together with John's revelation, everything was then orderly written in a book, and due to the 2 letters of Paul to the Hebrews, it was called the New Testament, which was approved by all bishops. It was again remodeled over the following period of 100 years, so that the evangelist John was once again shoved into the background, and instead, Matthew, Luke and Mark were placed in front of him. And also in the chapters and verses, small changes were made, and everywhere it was specified on whatever holiday this or that gospel had to be preached to the people, which the Greeks still hold on to even today, just like some other Christian sects. However, Rome has still made its own arrangement, and later it has fabricated for the people a short gospel excerpt for Sundays and holidays. They strictly forbade the people to read the entire gospel, as well as the old books of the Jews, and they even punished the trespassers of that law with death. That is how the current New Testament was developed, and it was gradually accepted by the Christians about 1,300 years ago. But it has received some various changes, especially by the Roman bishops, and sometimes even some arbitrary addendums were added, like the ones in the Roman Vulgate. All of this is especially easy to see in the exegeses of the Roman Church Fathers, and every man who can think clearly will soon recognize whose spiritual children they are. In there exists an additional teaching, according to which the souls of the decedents have to sleep until the day of judgment. This teaching was described with the Greek term psychopanikia, meaning soul sleep. This teaching, however, only existed until a pope introduced the still existing Roman sacrifice of the Mass, which he explained to the Roman Christians, saying, with all pomp, that it has, being a bloodless sacrifice, altogether the same power and might as the previous bloody sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and that Christ would sacrifice himself in this way to his Father in heaven for all the true Christian believers of the Roman Church. And that a correct believing Christian who would let them read such a sacrifice for his sanctification, together with the necessary performance of a small worldly offering, will then be able to be awakened by Christ immediately after the death of the body, without a long soul sleep, and be called into his eternal bliss. And if the Christian was not perfect, he could perform several such sacrifices, and so evade eternal damnation, and after a short purification in the beyond, in the so-called purgatorial fire, still enter heaven. Therefore went the dogma of the soul sleep gradually to sleep as well, because with its preservation, the newly invented sacrifice of the Mass would have yielded nothing, just like that ridiculous dogma, which actually taught that God had created only a small part of humanity for heaven, while all the rest was meant for hell. Both of these 2 foolish tenets have finally been revoked over time, but instead, the 5 well-known church commandments and several newly created sacraments have been introduced, which I don't even need to mention, since each one can easily recognize them. Even though the Christian teaching has been simplified by the strict counsel of Emperor Constantine, there has still quite a lot of rubbish remained in it, in spite of the occasionally approved and undertaken inspections, of which all caused a certain splitting off into sects, whereby some new Christs have been born, all of which, until this very hour, still pull on each other's hair as arch-enemies. That's why now the final and greatest inspection has to take place, and as stated previously, this inspection machine is called science. The Christs who treat each other with hostility must be thrown out, including all things connected to them, so that the one true Christ, preached of by John, may appear among the people and live with them. This will involve quite a number of hard and difficult battles, which the true followers of Christ will not have to fear at all, for they will be empowered in everything in many ways, which will even enlighten those who were less believing up to now, and they will not be able to extinguish that light anymore. And I, the Lord, who has spoken these things to you through the mouth of John, will afflict the entire earth with all kinds of judgments and calamities, with massive wars, inflation and famine, with all sorts of pestilence for man and animal, with large earthquakes and other earthly storms, with great floods and fire. But my people will be protected within the law, and they won't suffer any shortages. But whoever will still seek to persecute me during this, my second coming, I will certainly know how to exterminate this one from the earth. Now, regarding all the other contradictions within the 4 present Gospels, those will lose themselves within John, and as said before, I will add my own addendum at the end, whereby all the incorrect information will completely and properly be recognized. And therefore, be satisfied at the moment with what I have given you, and work diligently with John, for by that you will reach an overabundance of the inner light. However, if someone has something they really want to know, just ask and I will be ready to give you a short and bright light about it. Amen.